Um, Tonight's program is, I don't want to say it's actually experimental because it's not quite that. But as you all know, we've just put out this movie, well, as many of you know, called Finding Happiness, which is about Ananda and the communities, but above all, it's about the principles on which Ananda is based. That movie will be released in India in the middle of April, and many of you have seen it in private showings, but in just another 2 months it'll be available through DVDs and video on demand, everything that you do. We perceive that film to be not so much about, let's get a lot of members and people coming to Ananda, although that may be a side effect. But the real point is that there are many principles that are the essence of what makes this Sangha what it is and makes the people in it so happy to be part of it. And after the movie was completely done, we had no idea what to call it. And finally the director, who of course had seen it countless times in the editing, really realized that the theme of the movie was happiness. Yoganandaji said that everybody in the world has two essential motivations for everything that they do. And that is, one is to escape suffering, and the other is to find happiness. On its highest level, to find divine bliss, but people have many levels as they go toward that. And if you look at anyone's life, if you look at your own, you will realize that always you are motivated by one or the other. Much of the time, the decisions we make are very bad, and they do not, in fact, release us from suffering or bring us happiness, but some part of us believes that they will. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. So part of our thought with the making of this movie was that we would then follow it up with practical seminar, practical workshop, with the idea of finding happiness. Because the film is not yet released in India and is just being released in America, and Europe hasn't even really started, the whole project is still in motion. I was involved in the making of the film, and I've been working on the distribution of it to a certain extent. And Shivani, who's the producer, she and I have talked a lot about how do you take a whole life of everything that's involved and make it into a 3-hour workshop. And I have been very concerned myself. I didn't want it to be superficial, because the power of what makes Ananda Sangha and Ananda communities throughout the world what they are, it's not like a popular movement. Just sing this song, say this little mantra, do this little ritual, and everything will be better. It's much deeper, much more shifting at the core, and much more permanent in the change that it creates. So I've really wanted to contribute to trying to make a workshop that would be easily grasped by anyone, that wouldn't require that you take 5 preparatory courses to get Kriya initiation, but at the same time would at least direct people toward depth. So a few months ago in November, actually right after I returned from India, I was here in September briefly, I had to go to Dallas, Texas for a showing of Finding Happiness, and I experimented with the seminar. I can be a little last minute about things, and the seminar was on Saturday morning, and the movie was shown on Friday. And about 11 o'clock on Friday night, it occurred to me that we had the workshop the next day. And I prayed to Swamiji, and I had a picture came into my mind of 5 points that I think are the key points. And so this is the second time. I'm sort of saying all of this to you because many of you are friends. And I want to try to share this with you, and I want you to help me by answering and asking questions, and just sort of see if you see what it is that we're trying to create here. And also, I think it's an end in itself, because I think it's a very interesting way to talk about it. But I also just wanted to give you a context. because I'm talking to all of you, but I'm also thinking of a bigger picture when we do this. Just a moment. I think that's everything. I was very pleased when we did this in Dallas. Oh, I was going to say, we only have a little more than an hour and a quarter here. So I can't go into every aspect of it as deeply as we might if we had a whole day. But I still think it's very interesting. So bear with me, and I think we'll have a good time. Okay? I'm going to start by putting, here's the thinking of this. Everybody wants to have happiness, bliss. Very few people do. And so I'm trying to understand what essentially wrong understandings about life keep us from having happiness. And when I thought about it, I came up with five essential points. And we'll start with the first one. We'll write all five of them up here first. The first difficulty people have in not finding happiness is they think that happiness is going to come later. That if I just do all the things that I have to do first, then I will be happy. And people don't appreciate the fact that it's always now. So the first point on finding happiness is to understand the nature of time. And that's where we'll start tonight, because it interestingly underlies everything. But then I'll put all five points up here. The second point is the word karma. And this isn't so much a very big, subtle understanding of the law of karma, but the principle of karma simplified down to this very simple point, which is that karma is always fair. In other words, we're never a victim. Nobody is ever doing anything to us. We are just in this law of cause and effect as it relates to our own consciousness. We act in a certain way, it brings certain results, and we experience it. People waiting to live in the future, people thinking that somehow or another something unfair is being done to them. The third point is, materialism. And this is believing that there is an actual living happiness that can be given to us from things. And I don't mean, there's a distinction I realized in material things. I'll just say this briefly. There's a difference between tools and things. If you're a photographer, you may have a really fabulous camera, but it's not the thing itself that you're trying to get the energy from, you're using it. You may have a fine computer, many different things. But what happens in terms of material things, and here's the word, and the word is inert. I was talking about this for those of you who were here last night. Material objects do not have life force. They do not have consciousness. They are inert, and therefore they cannot in any way amplify back to you your own experience of happiness. They really just sit there. So whatever happiness you get from all the things that you acquire is really only what you have inside. You're projecting it out. There's no living force. Material things are inert. You could call them dead. But anyway, the fourth one is relationships. And people's lives are happiness or lack of it is to a large extent defined by other people. And what we don't really realize is that we are here to serve others. And in serving others, all that we're trying to get from other people begins to come back to us. But once again, our happiness is stolen from us because we think that other people are here to serve us. And it gets very difficult. And the fifth one is the simple word energy, which is the whole universe is a field of energy, and the key to happiness is the kind of energy you put out, which is a reflection of your consciousness. Okay? So these are essentially, in terms of finding happiness, I think the 5 essential areas where if you start looking at where things begin to break down for people, you realize they're always breaking down somewhere. The 5th one being energy. People imagine that the less effort I put out, the happier I'll be. Or their consciousness is very not elevated, and they think somehow that's going to make us happy. So we make these are the where we fall apart or find our way. Okay? And I'm going to take them off the board and just start with number 1. Well, it looks like we're going to be able to halfway see them the whole time, which is probably just as well. All right. A few years ago, and some of you, I may even have shared this, I think I did share this in this very room last year, but we're going to share it again. Starting with time. Swamiji has always talked about time, and I have always had the hardest time understanding what he means. Everybody tells us, I mean, this is like common knowledge. People say past, present, future, it's all an illusion. Eknath Toles wrote that book that everybody likes, Be Here, what is it now? He just calls it Now, I think, which I'm always grateful when one of these far-out ideas kind of cracks through and becomes really popular, because then we can all talk about it and at least there's some generalized understanding. But I just could never grasp how this all works. And this is the picture, and again, I apologize for those who've already seen it from me. If we draw a big circle, and that circle is past, present, and future, the thing about a circle is that any point that you're standing in, it's always the same point. There's no variations. When we draw straight lines, you know things are happening sequentially. But if we think of past, present, and future, we have a point. Let's say this is where we are right now. And on this point, we are in relationship to all these other realities. Now, when we choose to incarnate in a particular body, we become identified with that body, and that body exists in time. It has a birth, it has a conception, it grows in the womb, it becomes a baby, and now it becomes an adult, and each one of us, our existence is very largely defined by the concept of time. We may have the idea, whichever way we're going, that we had previous incarnations. We may have the idea that we're going to have future incarnations. But nonetheless, the identity that we live with is dependent upon time even to exist, right? Now, in the center of past, present, and future, you would have what you would call the eternal now. And it exists, and so here's the interesting reality about the eternal now. When you're in the center of the circle, the past, the present, the future, it's all exactly the same distance from eternity. Whereas we tend to, living on this little edge of it, the past seems really far away, the future seems really dim. But the power of living in the now, among the many reasons, is that when you're standing here, all of it is exactly the same to you. And this is a kind of visual representation of how we talk about when a master is self-realized. When you step outside of the reality, this is how a great master can know your past lives, predict your future lives. He lives in relationship to all of it, very different. Look how isolated this dot is from these realities, but not from here. Now, there's a factor about all of life which is extremely important here, which is even though there are absolute states of realization, and Swami Kriyananda always emphasized this because it's so important, all of spiritual life is directional, which means it isn't a question of I'm standing here and the only alternative is to be on the other side of the room. It's a question of where I'm standing, which way I'm facing, and how much I'm moving toward that goal. And Swamiji had a genius, and there's no other word for it. It was an absolute genius for being able to understand where each one of us was standing and how to actually give us our actual next step, not like some idea of who we might be. It's a very delicate thing on the spiritual path to be determined in your effort, but also gentle even with your own self. And Swamiji was always so kind to us. He never exhorted us. In any setting that I ever saw, he never exhorted us to great effort. He just saw where we were and magnetized out of us our own next step. I myself was in a difficult situation once where he had asked of me something that was quite reasonable and positive for me, but I just couldn't do it. And I didn't want to be insincere with him, so I said, you asked me to follow this course of action and can't do it. I don't think, as I've said to you before in this, I don't think he took an extra breath before he said, well, so much for theory, let's deal with reality. And he didn't waste a heartbeat trying to make me feel badly or to exhort me to greater effort. He just said, all right, so now what'll we do? And then he just proposed an alternate course of action, but that was still taking me in the direction that I wanted to go. So when we think of directional in terms of time, I'm not familiar really with Eckhart Tolle's book, but I know just a little bit that I read. There's a certain tone, and I'm not going to put it on him because I'm not qualified to say. But sometimes people will just say, do it. Just like stop being identified with that and be identified with this. It doesn't work well for me. I need a little bit of movement. So Swamiji's directional idea is very relevant to the concept of time in relation to happiness. Okay, the more identified we are with this little dot, the more blind we are to past and future. And I'll use examples like this. And this also begins to spill over into karma, because all of these ideas begin to spill over. In the community where I live now, actually, this is not as unusual in India as it is in America, but in the community where I live now, the cars, there's a parking area that's right outside the windows. And my bedroom window, it was possible for a car to park just a few feet in front of that window. And this man, early one Saturday morning, when, everybody's, in America we don't work on Saturdays, so Saturday's a day when everybody takes it easy and sleeps in. This man pulled his car, because he had an apartment nearby. He pulled his car right outside my window. He was feet from my window. He wanted to work on his car. He immediately turned the radio up really loud. It was 6 a.m. And so all of a sudden, in my bedroom, where I am not up, if I had been awake, I would have been meditating. I'm listening to his radio, and he's out there working on his car. I didn't bother to even correct him, but I thought to myself, he had no idea that there was anybody else going to be impacted by his actions. He's so deeply identified with his own reality. He wanted to fix his car. He wanted to listen to the radio. That was the convenient spot. The fact that he could have just opened his eyes and seen my bedroom window didn't mean anything to him. So what's going to happen to that man is that sometime in future, somebody's going to be very inconsiderate to him, and he's going to be shocked and angry. Because the more we are identified with this limited idea of now, the less we see the implications of what's coming, the less we understand how the past created the present, because you can't see much from right there. But the more we move toward an expanded point of view, now we might not get all the way to eternity, but if we begin even to just think a little bit about past and future, or to think a little bit in a spiritual way that loosens this fixed sense of identity. Maybe I am this body, maybe I am this age, but I also have a divine nature. I'm also going to try to seek inner calmness, all the things that move us toward this. Even if we're standing here, all of a sudden, you see, we can see a little bit more of the past, we can see a little bit more of the future. So any of us who begin to expand our sense of identity, we also begin to expand our perspective. And then all of a sudden we begin to think about, maybe I'm the way I am because of the way I was raised. And if our perspective gets bigger, maybe I'm the way I am because of past incarnations I had. Maybe I will be in the future according to the energy I'm putting out now. Now, that's just the beginning. It's talking about happiness as our theme. You know, when we want to create happiness, we have to have some idea, we have to have some perspective on time. We have to see how we have made, and this moves into karma, we have to see how we have made a reality for the present, and how the present is going to make a reality for the future, until we can move all the way into living into this present moment. Now, the other part of it is that we have to understand, and this is the now aspect of time as it relates to happiness, is that, and this brings us to the point of consciousness and energy, all we ever experience is exactly what we are in this moment. And when the next moment comes, immediately, even if we can have some perspective on it, the past moment is just faded away. And all that we have in this present moment is the consciousness that we ourselves have created. And so if we can begin just to sort of see that there's no like just waiting here until everything gets better. And there's also no thinking it will get better automatically if we're not in right relationship to past and future, to energy, and to karma. And when you sort of start just even thinking a little bit like that, I was telling you all, at least in one of the classes here, about a man who was doing seminars for people with terminal illnesses, and how he helped them in their impending departure from this planet. They made a list of things that they were going to miss out on because their lives would end early. And then they made a list of things that they were going to get to avoid because their lives were going to end early. And the things that they were trying to escape actually turned out to be the greater work that they had to do. Well, I enjoyed thinking about that for myself. And I have to say, with some degree of self-satisfaction, there's many things I would like to escape, but seriously, I couldn't put anything on that list because there is no escape. It's like there is no way out. We are always going to be conscious, and our consciousness, no matter where on the spectrum you put it, is always going to be the exact combination of the karma that we have set in motion and the energy and the consciousness that we have. So there's no way to write it. If I don't do it now, I'm going to do it tomorrow. And so why even think for a minute that there's any way out of this? And a lot of people, they block their own happiness because they don't understand karma, they don't understand energy, and they don't understand time. I'm not enjoying it now, but later will not be now. And so the closer we move to understanding that it's always now, the more actually free we become. Because so much of our energy is spent in just trying to escape But once you just settle in with your whole heart and mind that this is the reality I have to face and there's just no way around it. This is one of the reasons, great saints have that quality. They're just, it's not like they're passive, but they're just utterly contented in the moment, because that's what it's always going to be. A friend of mine, for a period of time, she was a traveling teacher for another ashram, and she actually didn't live anywhere. She had no home, but she had her suitcase was her home, which actually really kept material possessions really down, because if they didn't fit, she couldn't have them. But I asked her how she managed to do that, and she gave me such a wonderful answer, which I've tried to follow. Wherever I am, she said, even if it's a taxi ride, I just settle in as if that's the only place I'm ever going to live for the rest of my life. In other words, this is a factor of being in the now. She knows there's been other realities. She knows others are coming. But nonetheless, here I am, and this is all that I'll ever be. So then we decide, what is the quality of my consciousness right now? And if it isn't what I want, when we start thinking about karma, we realize that the next minute is also going to be not what I want, because there's simply no way around this. And so the more we move toward the concept of now, the more we recognize that I might as well get down to work. A lot of the effort on the spiritual path and for self-transformation is imagining that it will be easier later. And we just blank out from the necessity to do it. This is a hard problem, but I'll just deal with it later and it won't be such a problem. One of the versions of the Ramayana that I read had this wonderful line I've never forgotten, when Rama was being exiled and his father wanted him to stay one more night. And Rama replied, "Inevitable disappointment is not made less by postponement." And it's a very solid thing to remember. And so inevitable effort to face and deal with whatever it is in your life, it's not made less by imagining that the future is not now. Okay, do I have any questions or thoughts just about this little chart before we go on to anything else? The other part of this one, which really affects our happiness, is when we're so deeply identified with the present. Swamiji makes this distinction, and this is what I've been reaching for here. Swamiji says you need to live in, but not for, the present moment. You understand the distinction? You have to always be in the moment of this reality, but not depending on this reality for our own happiness. That goes to the point of consciousness and energy. So we are in this moment, but we need to have our perspective be as close to eternity as possible, because one moment is not the same. When we're identified with time, if we're living for this, I was saying to our friends tonight, I've been living in the ashram here for a little more than a week, and I've just completely settled in, practicing my friend's advice. I just feel like this is the only home I've ever had, and I'm completely content here. I think I could go on for a really long time, and I'm leaving early tomorrow morning. Sort of startled me to realize that. And it's just a fact of life. Nothing holds. And so also we have a misunderstanding about time, because we don't realize that this wheel is always moving. And we think that our happiness will come when I get it fixed. And then we start living for this moment. I have my husband, I have my children, my mother-in-law. Her children all came out well, her 3 children, but the family did not stay geographically close. One of her children stayed close to her, but 2 of them just went on, my husband among them. And it wasn't like the family fractured, but the day-to-day life of the family was not integrated. And it was interesting to me that to the end of her life, she didn't have a lot of family memorabilia in her house. She had 3 portraits, one of each of her children, And when they were about 7 or 8 years old, each of them. And every time I looked at them, I realized that that was the point when, in a sense, the mother still owned them. They were still really her children at that point. In America, of course, everybody's more independent than they are in India. So those are the pictures that she kept. That was the moment she lived for, was that happy time when they were little children. I remember asking my own mother, what was the happiest time of your life? Oh, when you all were small, she said. Same thing. It's like you sort of get it all set up, and then it's working the way you want it to work, and that's my happiness. And this is the same. The picture is important here because we're always just moving toward the next step. And the extent to which we hold on to these conditions as the cause of my happiness, you're just simply doomed. That's all there is to it. And so it becomes just a question like, how much do I want to suffer? We hold these attitudes, then we suffer, then we're so bewildered as to why we're suffering. But it's right here, right in front of us. Okay. Any questions or thoughts about any of that before we move on from it? Okay. The next principle, which is so difficult, and I'm not really giving a class on karma tonight because it's too much of a story, but all of you are familiar with the word karma, and it has a certain habitual passivity, is how I often hear it used in the Indian culture. And I was really appreciating this afternoon that self-realization, as Master taught it and as Swami Kriyananda really expounded it, is a foreign teaching for Indians. And I think it's an important point to realize. When it came to America, it was a foreign teaching for us. And when I'm bringing it back here, and we have brought it back here to India, it's actually a foreign teaching to India, because it is not Hinduism, and it could only have sprung from the ancient culture here. And it definitely has its roots in the Himalayan yogis. But it's very important that we think about these things from a whole new perspective. And I think the principle of karma has been, to a certain extent, a kind of strength for the long cycle of Indian history, which is just this realization that these great forces are playing themselves out. And it creates a certain capacity to endure, because it's just my karma, and we're just going to have to go through it like this. And there is strength in that. But if we're really wanting to think about happiness, karma has to become an extremely dynamic concept, just the opposite of giving us a kind of passive endurance. It has to give us a dynamic strength, because we need to begin to understand that nothing that happens in this world is random. That people are always asking me about free will, and I've finally, I think, begun to have a way of responding to it. Of the many answers that Swamiji has given, this is the one that I like the most, which is we live in an interrelated universe. In fact, the way the scientists really talk about this, it just creates a picture of the universe that's so outside what appears to be happening. We appear to be so separate from one another, and we appear to have this, and this is why people always ask, we appear to have this free will. I can do this, I can make this decision. But every point that we find ourselves in has been created by all the energy that we put out up until then. The way we respond, the way we think about ourselves, the people that we're with, the very bodies that we made, everything about it. I've been teasing my friend Brian, who's traveling with me, because he's too big for small cars and he's too big for airplanes, and I made a body that really fits into all these things really comfortably, but he has a very fine father, but his father is a big man. So I said, well, it was worth it.
You have this big body that's really uncomfortable on international airplane flights, but you got this great family because of it. And we're teasing, but not really. Everything is the result of reasonable choices that we made. Sometimes we were having to balance factors, that brought us into company with these people. And the people that we meet, we're not meeting them for the first time. The Buddha said that at one time or another, you were close with every single person on the planet. I mean, I can repeat that, but I can't even begin to go there. It's just so far outside. Even just to think that the people that you're closely related to, that these are continuing relationships, and that you're here dealing with them, either loving them or disliking them, or living in harmony or living out of harmony. I have some people in my life that I have to work all the time to tell what lifetime I'm in, meaning that there's just so much history that I can feel, some of it negative, of just expectations or distrust or all sorts of things, that the responses come, and I have to just stop and really try to think what's really happening in this reality compared to all the other realities that are there. And Swamiji is just so emphatic. You suffer in the way that you caused suffering in the past. He wrote that as a sentence in his commentaries on the Patanjali Sutras. I found that sentence in the book. I mean, I held the book up to the light to see if it would look different if I looked at it another way. I turned it back and forth. I just wanted to find a little wiggle room in there. Because if we really think about that, somebody takes your money, somebody doesn't give you a promotion, somebody's very unkind to you, somebody gets all mad at you about this, or everybody really loves you. It's just, it happens. Whatever you put out, this is what happens to you. Now sometimes you can't get your mind around that. That's very difficult. Why? Because we are identified right here. But the more we have moved our consciousness toward eternity, the easier it is to feel the truth of that. And it may not be that you actually remember, but at least you can feel that there's a flow of energy happening here. And we're going to skip ahead a little bit to number 5, which is energy and consciousness. Whether or not we respond to karma as being fair, what kind of consciousness we put out in relationship to it, really determines where the trajectory goes and whether we just have to keep living through it again. The essence of karma is really a simple words. It's unlearned lessons. Okay? We need to learn to be as the masters are. Last night I was saying Swami Kriyananda has set the bar really high for us. He's unconditionally loving and open-hearted. And that's what a free soul is like. He's unconditionally loving and open-hearted because he has nothing to protect. He lives in the eternal now, past, present, future. It's all just harmony for him. He sees that if so-and-so is deluded now, they'll be free. And their freedom is as close to him as their delusion. And their goodness of heart is as close to him as their present evil. You see, when you're standing at this point, if everybody ultimately is going to realize their bliss nature, the closer you are to here, the easier it is to see it. And not only do you see others that way, but you also see yourself that way. How we feel about ourselves is a lot of how we treat others. For many years of my life, I used to think that the way to change myself was to always be really hard on myself. And then I noticed it wasn't working for me. And I realized that I was exerting that same sort of get it together, sister, energy toward everyone around me, and it wasn't working for them either. But one of the reasons Swamiji could be so kind to us is because he sat here. And I've mentioned to you before, whenever he would perceive someone's suffering, he would naturally feel compassion for them, but a lot of us become a little uneasy when we perceive suffering. Or we become really uneasy when we suffer ourselves. But Swamiji said when he saw people suffering, he thought only of their ultimate realization in God and their merging into bliss, and he thought about how this present suffering would make that freedom all the sweeter. And from the perspective of the eternal now, it's all as close. So when a karmic event is happening to us, the way to have our consciousness and our energy be what we want it to be is also to be in right relationship to time. The closer we are to the eternal now, the more we can say, so. I was listening to Swamiji talk about, on these little programs he has called Ask Me About Truth. And he had his hips replaced twice, actually 3 times. He doesn't have 3 hips, but one of the operations had to be redone or refixed. And he never liked to take a full anesthesia. He didn't like to be put unconscious. So he was able to persuade the doctor to just give him a spinal to replace these hips. But on one of the operations, the anesthetologist did not give him enough. And he came back, the feeling came back into his lower body while they were still sewing him up. I mean, for all of us, this would be like, well, a living hell. Yes, your worst nightmare. Swamiji is because he'd never lost consciousness, but he's beginning to regain feeling. There's multiple layers. They were still sewing up some inner layer of his hip, and he began to be able to feel it. And he realized if he said anything, they would have to give him a full anesthesia at that point, because there was no way they could re-inject this. So he just decided that he just wouldn't say anything. Now, not only did he not exclaim or complain or comment, he also had to hold himself completely still. Because if any movement, if any, reaction took place, then they would know, and that would be too unnerving. They would feel they had to do something about it. And when you ask Swamiji, sir, how did you do it? Well, first of all, he says he put his mind elsewhere. But the other thing he said is, well, I've had a very good life. He said a little pain for a little while never hurt anyone. Just so casual, little pain for a little while. And what happens to us, you see, we're attached to this one tiny spot. And when a little pain sets in, because this is the only perspective we have, if this is the only perspective we have, we're not seeing ourselves in relation to eternity, and therefore we see neither the past nor the future. We don't remember that it's been a nice life and a little pain won't hurt us, it'll go away. Then everything can disturb us. Just somebody being mad at you for half a day can just completely disturb you. You're having a headache, a backache, an argument with your friends, just anything. It can disturb us because first of all, we're not thinking about that everything is happening as the way it needs to happen, and we're not thinking about time. There's another story. Last night I was talking about death and dying, but there's a beautiful story told by, put this down again, told by Viktor Frankl, who's a wonderful psychologist. And he has a method of psychology that's called search for meaning. And he is a Holocaust survivor. He went through concentration camps, which gives a certain poignancy to his understanding. And he tells this story about a man who was brought to him for counseling. And the man had had a long and very, very happy marriage, and his wife had died, and he was just unable to recover from the loss of her company. So a friend had recommended, so he came and he's talking to Dr. Frankl. And Dr. Frankl asked the man to talk about his wife, because that was the subject at hand. He talked about what a wonderful woman she was, what a wonderful life they had together, and he just went on for some time about how beautiful she was. And then he said, were you very dependent on each other? Was she as fond of you as you are of her? Oh, yes. He said, if she had been widowed and you had died first, would she have suffered from your absence? He said, I don't know what she would have done. He said, I took care of everything for her. If she'd been left by herself, she wouldn't have known what to do. And Dr. Frankl just looked right at the man and he says, you see, you spared her that suffering. And all of a sudden, the man just heard what was being said. He didn't say another word. He stood up. He extended his hand. He shook the doctor's hand, and he just walked out of the office. You know, it's all just a question. And Dr. Frankl's whole psychological method is, if we can find meaning in what we're doing, then you can endure anything. And through the power of the concentration camp, he said, when everything was taken away from them, that's when this thought began to occur to him, because he watched the people around him. He said, those who could find meaning, and he tells the story. It's a book called Search for Meaning. It's a fabulous book to read. And he said, when absolutely everything is taken away from you, you discover, and you can hardly see the words, but you still have your consciousness. You still have your inner reality. And he said, that alone gives meaning to your life. Now, this is, I was relating that, the story of Dr. Frankl and that man, both to karma and also to the idea of time and also of our consciousness. Nothing in itself inherently dictates our experience. It all depends on how we look at it. So there's two other realities here besides the fairness of karma and the energy we put out, which is how we relate to the material world. And it's a huge factor. It cannot just be dismissed. It's very interesting to me that in Yogananda's book, the one that we publish here called How to Be Happy All the Time, which is a compilation. He didn't write it. We compiled his teachings on the subject. At least half that book is about money. Because whether we have money and how we relate to that and the material things of our life is just a huge part of how we feel about ourselves and how we function. Now, what we have to understand, and I've used the word materialism in the fact that things are inert, is that the more we move away from the idea of energy and consciousness as both the source of our power and the source of our satisfaction, and the more we think about anything, whether it's a material object or just something in the material world that we imagine by itself has the power to give us happiness. Yesterday I was talking about putting in a carpet in our house and all the energy that goes into getting our material things in order, and then imagining that that's actually going to change our consciousness, that the thing itself is really going to be able to affect the way we feel, that we don't understand that things only have life force insofar as we give them life force. A friend of mine was talking about, she wrote to Swamiji and she was saying that there was nothing in her life that she wanted, that she was enthusiastic about. And she was just sort of complaining about not really having work to do that she loved. And Swami just answered her and he said, nothing is going to give you any energy back until you first give energy to it. He said, you have to engage yourself first, and then once that energy is flowing, then the flow of energy itself is really what you're enjoying, and you'll become enthusiastic when you begin to put out that kind of energy. Well, what happens so often in our lives is that when we don't have energy ourselves, then we try to use money or we try to use things to sort of give a meaning to our lives. And these days, because of so much advertising and this, this huge material world that is always telling us that we are inadequate unless we have these certain things. Every so often I'll see an ad, a picture ad, or a television, a moving ad, and sometimes the picture of wealth that's presented to us as if somehow that was like a normal standard. And we have to really understand, especially in the world that we live in, this is a planet that just has become so confused about the source of happiness that we just imagine that we just need more and more. One of my Indian friends coming to America, they had their children in the school that we run in our community, and he was just commenting to me about among the many differences between India and America. He said they go over to their American friend's house where they have children, and every child, he says, has a big room that belongs only to the child, and the room is full of things that belong to the child. And I just grew up that way. I wasn't excessively materialistic, but I had my own room, and I had a bunch of stuff in there that was my stuff. And I just for a minute, I kind of saw it from another perspective, that little children are just being taught that this is all my stuff. These are all my things. I remember my sister-in-law, she tried as hard as they could, and she did a very good job of keeping her children's rooms very, very empty. And she was always just telling everyone, please do not buy things for my children. And it was such a sort of relief to go into the rooms that their children have, and there were just a few things in there, that the children were not being taught, to surround themselves with all this stuff. I know very little about feng shui, but I learned a simple principle that had so much effect, and at a certain turning point in our life, I became fanatical about purging my house. And this was the rule about physical things that was taught to me. Hold it in your hand. If it gives you energy to hold it in your hand, because it's beautiful, because you genuinely love it, because it's useful. I have an Apple computer, a laptop computer. I love that computer. I always carry it around with me. I travel with it. I like the way it feels when I hold it. I like its little bag. Everything about it is good. It's a tool, for sure, but I also really like the computer. And so I love having that. I have a pair of shoes that just fits me perfectly. I can walk really comfortably in them. Every time I see them, I love those shoes, right? But then I have these other shoes that were a little bit expensive, so I don't want to throw them away, but they sort of hurt across the arch, and and they never really looked as good as I wanted them to, and now they're scuffed at the toe. You hold it in your hand. If it takes energy away from you or disturbs your mind in any way, get rid of it. Just get it out of your life. In fact, the advice is have an opaque bag and put it into the bag so you can't even look through and see that it's still in there. Maybe it takes energy because, my aunt gave it to me, and it's not really my taste, and I just don't know what to do with it. If it's neutral and it's of practical value to you, you might not get really excited about your forks. Maybe they're just your forks, but you use them every day. But if you walk around your material space, because according to the principles of feng shui, qi, which is the flow of energy, all of those things that the mere sight of them or the touch of them drains energy out of you, it blocks the flow of energy, not only in your house, but in your whole life. And I went through my house like a crazy person, is the only way I can say it. And I took bags and bags and bags of stuff out. And I'm not really a shopper even. It's just that so much material stuff had come into that house, and it's inert. It doesn't give you any energy. It just sits there. And we begin to feel in our own lives that we're just sitting there. Isn't that how we feel? And when it's all just out, gone, then all of a sudden your energy is able to flow again. I mean, I know these are things that people have said often. The feng shui, if it gives you energy, keep it. If it's neutral, if it takes energy away. That to me is the most dynamic way to look at it. Because people have different needs. They have different feelings about things. I myself, before I was married, I had a very austere attitude. My friend, in commenting about the little cottage that I lived in, said it had my unmistakable decorating stamp, absolutely nothing. And that was exactly right, just absolutely nothing. I had no decorations, I had no aesthetics, just nothing. That was what I liked. I married a man who has a very strong visual sense and a very strong sort of appreciation of design and many other things. So from him I've learned, and that's the kind of home he would like to have, and we've found a compromise on it. Because for him, a few beautiful things, a well-designed place, it gives him energy. And so when he holds up some small thing that might be neutral to me, it gives him energy because of his aesthetic relationship to it. Swami Kriyananda had many things that he used in his life, and it was often a little difficult for people to understand that he was living very simply. But the complexity both of his mission and the expansiveness of his consciousness included a lot more in it than an average person would include. So we really have to be in right relationship to the things in our life according to the energy that they give us, that we experience in relationship to them. And never imagine for a moment that by loading your life with material things, that somehow there will be an active shift of your consciousness. Does that make sense to everyone? And of course, the other side of that is, as Sri Yukteswar said, you have to learn to live comfortably within your purse. And people who overspend, and I'm not talking about when you're overspending because you have to put your children through college or something like that, but people who overspend are usually seeking to have some inanimate object give them energy when there's no essential consciousness there to change you. Okay? So, then we come to the concept of relationships. And relationships relate very strongly to the idea of karma, and they also relate to the idea of time. And of course, the greatest drain to our happiness is the lack of understanding that it's our own energy and consciousness that we're working with. It's the hardest thing for people to understand. Let me just try to think about how this really works. Swami Kriyananda had such an unusual capacity to relate to people because he didn't need anything from anyone. You know, once you're living at that center of eternal now, and this awareness that everything that's ever happened is equidistant from you in that moment, and there's no need to be reaching because you're sitting at the center and all of creation is at your fingertips in a way of saying it. This relationship that we have so much with other people, where we're always hoping that there's going to be some movement, and that movement is going to ease whatever sense of dissonance we have within ourselves. Now, the paradox of relationships is so much that, in fact, people are a source. I mean, our relationships with people amplify whatever the inner experiences we have. It's not, very few people on the planet can really have complete fulfillment in solitude. Sri Yukteswar puts it in a most interesting way. in his book, The Holy Science, of which I know very little, so don't imagine suddenly that I'm an authority on that book, because it's a difficult book. But there's one section in it where he talks about the progress of spiritual life is the purification of the heart. And purification means that we remove from the heart everything that blocks our experience of God's presence within us, that the pure state of the heart is union with God. And then there are all these oscillating realities that prevent that. So he explains that there's several stages in the purification of the heart. There's 5 is what he says. And the first 3 require that we be in close relationships with other human beings. And he says the compelling urge that we have within us to find a partner, to find friends, to have children, to have a mentor, all of these different things that we do, it's like we're inwardly compelled to do it because our spiritual self knows that that's the only way we're going to progress through this. And after we progress through these stages of purity, the last 2 stages, we don't have to be in relationship with others in order to make it happen. Now, we tend to think of relationships as an end in themselves. That relationships are part of what we want to get into order in our little dot in time, that we want the right people in the right place relating to us in the right way so that we can stop the cycle and everything is going to be just as it's meant to be. You know, this man whose wife died, I have another friend whose husband just recently died after 50-some years. She said something so interesting to me, an Indian woman, she's married young and only recently was widowed. She said in India especially, women are taught to make their husband the center of the life. And she didn't object to that. She'd had a very happy life with her husband. But she said now that he was pulled out of it, she didn't know where she was. She didn't know where her own self was in the picture. And even though she's suffering and she's sad, she actually was saying very dynamically, she said, you know, I don't want to just go live with my children now. She said, they want me to go live with them because they've been living on her own. She said, but I don't want to miss this opportunity. I don't want to just become the mother of my sons. She said, I've already been the wife of my husband. I don't want to become the mother of my sons. I want to find out who I am in the middle of all of that. And no, because we get all these people set up around us. Now, the other thing that we don't understand is that it's this purification of the heart and this understanding of the inner freedom that we have that is the reason why we're drawn to all these people. And the karma that we face, the unlearned lessons of imagining that you can give me something that I don't already have. And more than that, that you owe it to me to give it to me. I went through a cycle when I was very first married where I became upset with my husband over something he hadn't done. And I felt a lot of pain in my heart because I was feeling, you know, that he was not behaving in the way I wanted him to behave. I mean, all of us, people do not behave in the way we want them to behave. Make a list. You can talk about your husband, you can talk about your coworkers, your children, somebody you've had to work with. People do not behave in the way we want them to behave. They have this extremely annoying habit of following their own karmic trajectory. They are born in a certain state, and they have to follow it through. I went through this cycle with my husband once where I realized, he more pointed it out to me, I really just wanted him to be a woman. And I went through a period of counseling, marriage counseling. I was offering it, not receiving it. A number of couples came to me, and the woman had complaints about the man. And in every case, she was upset with him because he was masculine, not feminine. And he was almost perfect, except if he was just a little more like her, then he would have been ideal. But that little bit of a twist was just enough to move him from being male to female. I remember my husband said it to me like this, because I was wanting him, to tell me more about his feelings and to talk to me more about what he was thinking and to be more engaged like this. And he said to me, "I don't even find that attractive," he said. "Not only am I not going to do it, it doesn't even look good to me to be like that." He said, "I wasn't born to be like that. This is something else that I'm trying to do." Now, it was very interesting to me because, I moved out a little bit of my own bubble that, we got married so that he could fulfill my idea of what marriage was supposed to be. And I started actually looking at him, trying to understand where he was trying to go. I mean, that was a very important thing. I kept thinking where he ought to go was where I wanted him to go, that would make my life more like I wanted it. And when he told me, I don't even think that's attractive, I had to just stand back and think, well, if he had wanted to be a woman, he would have been a woman. He wouldn't have taken a male body. Swami Kriyananda, you have to take this in the right way. He was the least prejudiced person on any level. But he was asked, we were selling these little books, Secrets of Prosperity, Happiness, Peace, Meditation. They were selling really well, and the salesman said, "All these books are bought by women. Write a Secrets for Women, and it'll be a bestseller." Swami's response was, "How could I write that book?" The next morning, he said he woke up and he just felt completely feminine all through his consciousness. He was a perfectly balanced person, but he was still more a man than a woman. He felt this completely feminine energy. For 3 days, he wrote this book. These are just 30 little aphorisms. He said during that time, phone calls would come in and people would want him to make decisions. He said, "I can't." He said, I'm in female consciousness right now. I can't come out and make those kinds of decisions. So he wrote the book. It was a very good book. Afterwards, he said to some of us, he said, "For 3 days I lived in the consciousness of a woman. It was terrible." He said all those emotions, all those feelings just going all the time. And I had to say, yeah, that's the truth. That part of it is terrible. There's nothing you can say. But coming back to this and, sort of capturing this, I looked at my husband clearly and I tried to think, where is he trying to go? What is his next unlearned lesson? Not how do I want him to relate to me, but how can I serve him? And it's so different. And of course, think about it. When you really tune into other people's reality and try to help them move forward in it, they love you for it. So everything else that you're trying to get, you suddenly get because you become a true friend. You really move out of just what do I want from this, and you see, how can I help you go where you're trying to go? And that's what real love is about. I was helping this woman who was having so much trouble with her husband, and I said to her, she was raising sons. I said, "You're always trying to help your sons develop in the way they're trying to go. Why are you always trying to get your husband to go where you want him to go, instead of trying to feel where he's trying to go?" Now, sometimes you can only go so far with that because we have our own limitations. But if we just approach the people in our lives and ask, what is your intention and how can I help you? If it's a dishonorable intention, of course you don't want to help them, but you understanding what I'm trying to say. So much of our unhappiness just comes from a false idea. And again, it's also becoming too identified with this little tiny piece and not thinking enough about eternity. We don't own the people in our lives. We don't own our children. I'm just amazed what people, I don't have children, what people expect from their children without ever cognizing that this isn't me. This is a destiny here that has to be fulfilled. True friendship. That's what Swamiji did for all of us. He just stood there and he thought, how can I help you? In the highest possible way. As a result, the man was overwhelmed by people who loved him, who would do anything for him. What we're all trying to have in our lives, he had it by only thinking about the welfare of us. And also, of course, then, we all want to be useful. And we all want to feel that our lives matter. And so much satisfaction comes from that. And then also, if you're thinking about karma, why do people rebel against you? Why are they angry at you? Because, well, in some other lifetime, you must have done something that made them angry at you. We suffer according to the suffering we have inflicted on others. And if we want our future to be different, then in this particular point, we have to start thinking, where are you trying to go and how can I help you get there? What good place are you trying to go to and how can I help you get there? How can I help unravel for you whatever karmic knot you're in right now? Okay, I think that is all that I have to say about that. Do we have any questions or thoughts or comments before we? Yes.
When you said dynamic karma, like you said, generally it's endurance. It's what's done in the past, present life or past lives, and therefore just endurance. So it's passive, and that's how we generally understand it in the Indian context or the Hindu philosophy. It's endurance of something that's already been sown. Right. So nothing can be done about it. But then to turn that into a learning and to get the learning or the dynamic karma that you talk about, how does
I didn't finish that thought, no. No, I really didn't. Okay. We don't work out any karma at all just by sitting there and letting it rain over our heads. What I was wanting to say is karma is unlearned lessons. I remember now, I didn't finish the thought. We have to learn how to be self-realized. We have to learn how to be completely in the eternal now and an instrument of the divine. The karma is what comes to us that in some way interrupts our ability to do that. And it's challenging us to expand our consciousness, not merely to just hold on and wait until it's over, but it's asking us to expand our perspective and our consciousness so that we see it from another point of view. Karma hits us in time, right here, but the more we move to the eternal now, the more we see, oh, this is a force from the past that is unresolved. In previous lifetimes, I was angry, I was cowardly, I was selfish, I was afraid, whatever it might have been. So that wave now comes and it tries to pull us back, pull us away from our divine understanding. And if we raise our energy, let's use this image, by moving closer to our vision of eternity and just realizing that then we endure it, but we endure it from a perspective of complete acceptance and of trying to, what is this really trying to teach me and how quickly can I learn this? It may be somebody's very angry at you all the time, and what you learn to do is you learn to remain completely calm. Maybe they're insulting you and calling you terrible names, and you're able to just say, that's just their opinion, what difference does it make? Maybe you have suffered a deep disappointment, and that makes you want to just hunker down and close up your heart. And I just don't want to be involved with people anymore. I'm just going to be solitary. But you're not really rising above it. You're shrinking beneath it. And so when people just say, oh, it's just my karma, but there's no corresponding effort to expand your energy and see it from a higher perspective, it's just going to come again. The way Swami put it is, if the expansion of our consciousness is like this and karma, the karmic wave is like this, if we stay exactly the same and just wait for the wave to get smaller and then say we've gotten over it, we have absolutely learned nothing. Because the next time it comes, we're going to have exactly the same response. So what we have to learn to do is we have to change our response. And the response that we should have at all times is even-minded and cheerful. Oh, look, everything in my life has gone in a completely different way than I thought it would. But I move toward the eternal now, and I realize that the past, present, and future are all equally accessible to me, like Swami's having his hip sewn up. So I have a little pain, like, big deal. I endure it, but I endure it from the perspective of eternity, of a bigger reality. Oh, I must have really inflicted this on others. Let me just deeply accept that everything is being balanced now. Let me appreciate that I never want to inflict this on anyone else again. Let me be so kind to everybody around me. I don't want to have any shred of this energy in me anymore, so that we're dynamically engaged in the unlearned lesson that brought this to us. Otherwise, we'll just see it again and again and again. And every time we see it, it'll be now. And there's just no escaping it. The extent to which we close our hearts and allow ourselves to be pulled away from our inner joy, to that extent, we're going to just keep being tested until we can plant ourselves strongly enough. To forgive, to love, to let go, however it is, whatever you have to define it. Does that make sense? It's very important. Yes, of course it's our karma, and karma is absolutely fair, but what are you going to do about it? Do you want to just live in it forever? It's your choice. Somebody asked, what happens to all the people who don't wake up spiritually? I said, this. This is what happens. We just suffer. We just suffer and suffer. At a certain point you say, enough. It's worth it to me to face this clearly, to dynamically engage in it, so that at least I can go on to the next one, and I don't just have to see this one endlessly. That's been a big incentive for me when, I just had a nasty attitude that I just couldn't let go of, and I just think to myself, oh, Lordy, I don't want to see this again. This person has been treating me so unkindly. It really serves me to get over this, because otherwise I'm just going to see him again. I'm going to see this again. I'm so sick of it. My friend Shivani says, cultivate an attitude of being absolutely disgusted with some things. Because when you're really just completely disgusted with it, it's like the imagined effort of changing yourself looks like less work than just staying the same and enduring it. You have to kind of reach that dynamic where you shift. Yeah. Anything else? Any other comments? Yes, sir.
So I'm confused here regarding karma and suffering, yeah?
Uh-huh.
So from whatever I heard yesterday and today, what I understand is that happiness and suffering
Uh-huh.
are both in the mind. It's your thought.
It's your consciousness.
It's
Yes.
your consciousness. So if my consciousness says that I want to be happy in the present moment, then I'll be happy in the present moment. If I want to suffer in the present moment, it's my mind which tells me that I'm not being done something right, and therefore I'm suffering. So I'm just going to give one or two examples, and I want to understand who's suffering, why is he suffering, and whether what is the karmic effect of that.
Okay, it's, even though you can say it's the mind, it's really a lot more than the mind. Okay, it's, the best way to think of it is this way. Our true nature is bliss, unconditioned bliss, when we are fully conscious of our divine self. It's not my state of mind. This was Swami Kriyananda's state of mind. He was just, especially at the end of his life, he was always in bliss. His body was falling apart. He was in the hospital dying, near death with this, and he still had enemies who were still attacking him. All of these things would happen to him, and he just, it would roil around, but his consciousness was always aware that these were waves on the surface of the ocean, and that his consciousness was much bigger than the waves. The waves would just go up and down. That consciousness is much bigger than the mind. So see, part of the problem is it isn't the mind that just thinks it's happy, the mind that thinks it's unhappy. You have to use the word consciousness to really understand, because the mind is only one aspect of consciousness. So the beginning of it is, in order to really be able to choose, you have to be able to practice having a consciousness that's beyond the mind, that isn't just your thoughts. This is the practice of meditation, particularly, where you can calm the thoughts, or at least try to calm them, and discover that there is an inherent experience within you which is independent of external circumstances and even independent of the thoughts, that the thoughts are a manifestation of that consciousness. Another way to think about it is that there are vibrations of consciousness that are, the way Master described it, being projected like radio waves, and that our self is actually a radio receiver. The way Master put it is thoughts, he was speaking of, are not individually created, but merely received according to what we are tuning into. I mean, if we turned a radio on in this room right now, we would discover this room is full of radio waves. But we don't know it because we're not tuned to it. So he said, if you're determined by your karmic habit to be sad about things, you will receive all these reasons to be sad. If by your conscious effort, which becomes your karmic reality, you are always looking toward the uplifting and the positive and always attempting to feel the divine within you, you will gradually become tuned to that channel, and in exactly the same circumstances, you will receive something else. Viktor Frankl was a very interesting example of that, because there they were in the concentration camp, absolutely everything material, everything from society, every self-respect. It was just the most terrible thing in the world. You were left entirely and only with what you chose to draw. In his book, he doesn't write it as explicitly spiritual as I believe he was experiencing it. You can just draw what you want to draw in that moment. And he saw in himself and others that many people just had this inherent capacity, even then, to remain noble. And the more dark and terrible it was around them, the more that was an incentive to them to hold this nobility. And they got it by attuning themselves to that vibration of reality. And they actually played out many of the things that are here. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yogananda says, conditions are always neutral. Whether you experience them as happy or sad depends on the predisposition of your own consciousness. And that's determined by lifetimes of karmic habit. I mean, this is where simplistic ideas like be positive come from. But the quality of the magnetism you put out is the quality of what you draw in. And if you think like that, then it becomes different.
I just wanted to understand the karma of a particular situation. So I'll give you that situation. So let's assume somebody's father is terminally ill. Mm-hmm. He's admitted to the hospital. Mm-hmm. He's on a ventilator. Mm-hmm. The company that this chap works for pays for the father's medical help. So in his desire to save his father's life or extend his father's life, even though the doctor tells him the man is never going to come out of it, and you're wasting your money, he says, no, how can I let my father die? Let him die on the ventilator. Now, let's say this man is myself. It's just easier for me to relate. So, I don't know whether my father is suffering at that moment from whatever illness he has. There are other people waiting for that ventilator to become free, some of whom probably have a very good chance of revival, provided they're given the ventilator. At the same time, my mind tells me, this man raised me, made me what I am, how can I let him go? And I don't let the ventilator out, make it available to others in my desire to save his life or extend his life. What is it that I'm doing? What is the karma I'm creating?
There's about 5 different ways to approach that, and that's actually a very good question. The First thing you have to see, Swamiji gave me advice when I asked him a complicated question that was not that far different from the one you've asked. Because what you're really asking is, what is the higher good? What is the intuitive answer? You can put it, what is God's will at this moment? Okay, and you don't get to God's will by adding up this cause and that cause and this cause and that cause. This costs $75 and 2 people need this ventilator and he raised me. You don't get to intuitive answers like that. You get to intuitive answers by moving away from all of the fragments and moving deeper into the place where everything comes into unity, and then feeling how all the threads should be woven together. We think of that, I think of that as the will of God, but you need to be practicing all the time, living your life from a level where you're not just looking at the fragments, but you're moving out of the edge and you're moving toward the center where everything becomes unified. So you have a habit of living. Kriyananda put this to me, you have to practice when it's easier. You have to practice before your father is on the ventilator, living by something other than accumulated reasons weighed one against the other. You have to be living more in the divine flow. So that's part of the answer. The other answer, another way to put it, though, just on the level that you're asking it, is it's not letting him go. How can I let him go? The quality of his life is gone. He's trying to exit his body. He's worked hard for you his whole life. I mean, you're not punishing him by letting him go. You're blessing him by letting him go. It's over. How much do you want from this poor man? You know, he's done so much for you, and now he's doing his best to get out of his body, and you're making him breathe. Let him stop breathing. And again, this is like, you have to be in a larger picture. He was your father, but he's a soul. He hasn't always been your father. He won't always be your father. For you to grip him in that tiny little time-based definition, that's not love. You're not trying to serve him. You know, think about it in relationships. Where is he trying to go? He wants to go on. He's finished. You know?
Okay, so let's, if you have time, I want to move to a second situation.
Okay, let's try it, and then we'll stop.
So again, I'll just use myself as the person in the center of this. So
Okay.
let's say I work with an organization. There's 2-3 of us at a senior level.
If any of you all feel the need to leave, don't. I can see that you need. Yeah. Anybody who feels they need to leave, go ahead, but I'll continue to answer your question. Yeah, okay. That's all right. I could see it, and I knew it was a disturbance. Go ahead. No. Okay, so finish.
So we have a situation here where we built a very good organization,
Okay.
very vibrant, we work very well together, and something changes. Something changes, and I decide to move on.
Right,
And because of my contribution to the organization,
right.
they give me a golden handshake or whatever it is called, and they send me off.
Okay,
And they have a perception in their mind that I'm moving to ABC industry,
Right.
in ABC city with DCE company. However, what I have actually done is I have moved to a competitor
right,
to rebuild the same business with the competition.
right,
And then they realize that this is what has happened, your perception changes.
right.
And then they start to suffer, and then they start to malign me. And then start talking about the fact that this new company is going to die, and he's not going to do anything, he didn't do anything for us. So have I created suffering? Will I be a recipient of that suffering in the future as my karma? That is my question.
If you have deliberately lied to people in order to protect yourself, you will have set that dissonance in motion, that people will lie to you in order to protect themselves. So it depends on to what extent you are manipulating truth and taking advantage, the degree to which you're manipulating truth, taking advantage, protecting yourself at the expense of others. Now, inherently, to go work for the competition and advance your own cause, that would be kind of dicey. You would have to just figure it out. How much do you owe the people who trained you? You know, how much did they really give you? Did they pick you up from nothing and make you who you are, and this is how you repay them? That could be a tough karma. If it's a very impersonal situation and you just got a certain amount of training and now you're using it, that's something else. It's not, you can't just, because it has to do with the actual vibrations of what's happening, the actual consciousness of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And and you will receive, to the extent that you are dissonant and self-serving at the expense of others, self-serving at the expense of truth, then something will happen. It will have to happen because you've started weaving a fiber that goes in this certain way. Inherently, to leave one company and go to another and build a competition, but then are you going to go try to persuade those same customers that you're a better company? And you can see it depends on the reality of it. There's no theoretical answer to that one. Is that fair enough? No? Yeah? Yeah, sure. Oh, go ahead. Anybody can walk out of the room, but go ahead.
No, it's more to do with your your knowing Swamiji closely. When he wrote The Time Tunnel,
Yes.
He describes the way to get to another
Right. Another dimension.
Is there any physical reality to it? I mean, sorry, but
No, it's fun. I'm laughing because The Time Tunnel is a novel that Swami wrote about two little boys who discover a ruined laboratory, and then they go into this tunnel and they become tiny, and then they come out in another time zone, and then they learn how to time travel, and they make little time capsules. And much of science fiction becomes science a little bit later. I was laughing because we talked about how fun it was to be writing fiction, because then you didn't have to really explain it right down to the last. I wrote the introduction to that book, and if you read the introduction, I deliberately, tongue-in-cheek, kind of play a little bit with whether or not this is a true story or not, because Swamiji plays a little bit about whether it's true. I would say he was loyal to spiritual principles when he wrote that book. And so therefore, in theory, everything that's written in there could be done. Whether it would be exactly done in that way or not, he was having fun. And he enjoyed the fact that he didn't have to tie himself to anything real. But he used a lot of intuition because he described past and future. And in that point, I think he was being more factual than fanciful. But he was just being intuitive about what it would, if this were the consciousness of that age, this is what it would have been like. He has the boys go back and see how the pyramids were built. So he offers an explanation of how the pyramids were built, which I think was more than just fanciful. I think it was a real intuition about it. So there's different ways. Yeah, it's a very fun book if you haven't read it. Yeah, it's a great read. Okay, if there is nothing else, then I will say thank you very much. It's been a joy to spend an evening with you.